Greetings, traveler. A traveler called SLR Mod Shop recently asked how I would balance single player and multiplayer content in a game that features both. This was in context of the game that we're developing right now, but I think this is a bigger topic that can apply on many different games. So today what I want to do is give a little bit of context around this type of game, one that features both single and multiplayer, and then talk about the hard mode of dealing with this issue, as at least as I've experienced it throughout my career. Then I want to talk about the easy mode of dealing with this, that basically ensures that our design goals are straightforward and easy to chase, and of course it gives the best possible experience for the player. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 13 years now, and whenever there is a game that can have multiplayer as well as single player modes, this is often a headache for most game designers, because we have to make basically all these new rules, all this new content for multiplayer, while still having to work on the single player and then try to balance both somehow. It usually leads to quite a big headache. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the case where, let's say there's a game, and let's just take a simple example. So a fighting game, something like Street Fighter or something like that. So there's a number of characters. It's one-to-one combat. It's pretty straightforward, right? It's basically the same content where either you fight against a computer or you fight against a friend. Pretty straightforward. So why can we not have the same content in both single and multiplayer modes? Well, let's go into the hard mode and see how that would play out. It is often the case that it's not just the core of the combat that we need to do in a game and we need to show the player. We also need to teach the player certain things about the game, all the abilities, how all the systems work, and so on. Also, there is some sort of theme, some sort of background story in the game that we want to expose the player to before straight jumping into the combat. While at the same time, if the game offers multiplayer, there is the element of community that we want to show. We want to be able to enjoy all the things that we do in normal life in groups, so playing sports, having fun with our friends together out in a group. We want to get all these positive experiences from real life and manifest them in the game and show them to people from a different angle and have them enjoy them as much as possible. So that's one aspect of multiplayer, but we also want to keep things balanced in multiplayer. We want to make sure that if people use the same ability, it works the same for both of them, or the same character, and so on. So there is this illusion, at least in my experience, that, well, since it's the same base game, why do we need to separate the content? Why do we need to make different rules and a different environment for single and multiplayer? Can't we just plug in the human player in place of the NPC and basically leave the game as it is? In my experience, certainly you can. This is a possibility. However, there are certain things that make this route difficult. First of all, it's difficult for someone to jump straight into the multiplayer experience without having some exposure in the game before. There is typically these two polar extremes that exist in this situation. One is usually towards finding out about the game, understanding its systems, perhaps learning some of the backstory of the characters, all the soft fluffy things like that, which are very good and very important. And on the other hand, on multiplayer, you need very good balance between all the abilities. You need to be aware of what other people are doing and saying and thinking, and being able to experience that as quickly as possible. And often that takes precedence over the abilities of the game, so experiencing the game itself. And the more you try to bring these two together, the more difficult it becomes. If you try to brute force it and say, look, we'll just put all of these elements all in one space and people can do anything at any time, then in my experience at least, you end up with a situation where all of these elements that I just described are sort of stepping on each other's toes, and it's difficult for any player to enjoy any given one of them. And instead, there is this mix of experiences that doesn't satisfy any one particular need, and there's all this constant strife for a balance between them. So what can we do about this? In my experience, the best way to approach this is to simply split the two. And when I talk about splitting the two, I mean in terms of goals. So what is the goals of multiplayer, of the multiplayer side of the game, and the what's the goal of the single player experience, and then what is the goal of the multiplayer experience? Let's start with the single player. So if the game has both, if it features both, then likely what single player tries to achieve is first of all to teach. The game has many abilities, many characters, many different elements and so on, and the player knows none of them. So at some point before the player can get to enjoy them, the player should have the opportunity to learn about them. So single player is, in my opinion, a better environment for this because it's slower paced, there's fewer distractions, the game designer can better control the experience and can make sure that the player has as many opportunities to try something out, to fail as much as possible in that safe environment, and eventually understand all the necessary mechanics. Another element that's very important here is story. And by story, I don't necessarily mean this very, very long-winded 50-hour-long dialogue type of thing. It could be just narrative, it could be just short dialogues, it could be exposure to something visual in the game, some place, some event that tells a lot about what this whole experience is supposed to be. And again, I think this is better done in single player than multiplayer. Not that it cannot be done in both, but this is a better environment because from my experience, when you are playing with anyone, you likely have a real world social connection to that person. It's your friend or your cousin or something. You have things to talk about other than the game. Your relationship exists outside of the game as well. So if you're playing a game together and you're trying to experience its story or whatever, anything your friend says as the story's exposure happens will take precedence over whatever is going on in the game. If as you're listening to the story or an explanation about a mechanic or something in the game, your friend asks, for example, what are we doing tomorrow evening? Or makes a comment like, oh, that character looks really cool. That immediately shifts your focus from whatever the game is trying to tell you to whatever your friend is telling you. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way it is. So when that happens, it's difficult to focus on either of these things. If it's in single player and you can focus on what the game is trying to teach you and its story, it is much more easy to observe it and absorb it, in my experience. And all of this is very different from what multiplayer is trying to teach you and what the goals of multiplayer are. So thinking about, again, multiplayer activities in real life, or I suppose social activities within like social groups or sports and so on, then you form a team with some people and you go out to do some activity. That is the basic assumption for multiplayer. For video games, we say that, well, if a game is fun to play by yourself, then likely it is more fun to play with people you know. That is again the basic assumption here. So because the social element is so strong for people, it is just as strong in the game environment. So the first core aspect here is community. So when you're in the multiplayer aspect of things, being able to see what other players are doing, thinking, saying in the game is very, very important, not because you know them in real life, but also because what they're thinking about the game can vastly change the strategy of what you're doing, how the game will turn out, and of course how much you enjoy that game. Being able to hear your friends' reactions or their screams for strategy, you know, go left, go right, whatever, and their jokes that they make in mid-game, these things add to the enjoyment of the game immensely. It is very, very important to have this supported in the community aspect of the multiplayer in the game. The other very, very important aspect is balance. And you might be thinking, well, isn't balance always important in the game? Absolutely. But it takes different forms in multiplayer and single player. Let me give you a simple example. So let's say that in single player, the player is always powerful and basically wins every encounter with the enemies and the NPCs very, very consistently. Sometimes there's a little challenge, sometimes there's more challenge, but it is basically guaranteed that the player will win every encounter in single player. In multiplayer, when you're playing against human opponents, that is not the case. If you have a case where one of the two players is basically guaranteed to win every encounter, then that makes the motivation of the other player go down very, very much. So there, the balance between the two players is super important, and it is assumed that the power of both players should be as close as possible, while in single player, if the human player wins every time against the computer, not only that's not a problem, it is basically the right way to go. It is assumed that that is what you want. You don't want the computer to win half the time. You want the player to be winning all of the time, but hopefully with various degrees of challenge. So this is, in my experience, what the difference between the two are, and this brings us back to the content of the game. So if these two are so different, then why aren't we making two entirely different games and like forget about putting both of them in the same game? Well, we have the same content here, and the way we can take advantage of this is by thinking that the content that goes in single player can also go in multiplayer, and what you learn here can be applied in multiplayer. That is the biggest value of having both of them in the same game. So the same content needs to exist on both sides so players can benefit from it, but it doesn't need to manifest exactly the same way in both modes. Here you want to teach and you want to provide exposure to the story more, typically in most cases. In multiplayer, you want to make sure that people are enjoying the company of each other while having the sense of balance, because this will essentially motivate them to, even if they lose a match or a game and so on, understand what they did wrong and what they can do in the future to have a better chance of winning the next match. To answer SLR Mode's question about our game in particular, this also holds true. So the same content will exist in both modes, and the goal here is to make sure that single player teaches many of the mechanics as possible so the players can then use them in multiplayer. That is not to say that these two modes are completely disconnected from each other, because I still like the concept of being able to unlock things in single player and then have a chance of using them in multiplayer, but you know, in a sensible way that doesn't feel too restrictive. I know this is a little vague. I hope to be able to share more specific details in the future. So anyway, this is the approach that helped me navigate this disparity in balance between single and multiplayer in the past. I hope this is helpful to at least one other person out there. If you have any questions about this, I will be very happy to answer what I can. Thank you so much for your time, and as always, have fun.